Okay, so what you need to explain in detail is Kant's conception of freedom. We started this discussion last time, and it would be good for in your papers if you talk about how this conception of freedom differs from our everyday understanding of freedom or political freedom, or how we use the term. You might have heard on the news or somewhere else in public discourse. Whenever we use freedom, we use it differently than how Kant does. So the easiest way to start the conception is, for Kant, the concept of freedom should be understood in terms of autonomy. So that's the last question in your papers, the sixth question, the distinction between heteronomy and autonomy. And for Kant, the true freedom is autonomy. Now, to understand this, we need to understand the concept of autonomy, what it means. So, as with most philosophical terms, it comes from the ancient Greek words auto meaning self, same. It's like the word automobile, which is supposed to actually move itself, but it really doesn't move itself. I mean, it kind of moves itself, but you need to drive it, etc. So in the word automobile, you hear the word auto, autobiography, you are writing the biography of yourself, etc. Auto. The term here is the other term, nomos, the nomi, simply means law in the first instance. So freedom is self-law giving, self-law, an ability to give a law unto yourself. This is when you become and are truly free. Now, this obviously, as we said, comes from Kant's conception on page 23 that everything in nature works according to laws. Now, of course, when he says nature, the use of the term there is complicated because, as we said in response to Misha's question last time, he uses the term nature not just in the way that we understand nature as like a physical object, etc. It is also most of our actions that are natural. And that natural aspect of our actions is determined by complicated laws that govern our physiology, our psychology, our culture, our society, our politics, etc. So you can actually explain political actions, for example, in terms of natural laws by saying that people have, in addition to reason, also have greed, concern for reputation, concern for power. You can technically explain all of those in terms of laws of nature. But when we don't act according to laws of nature, then we still have to act according to certain laws. Because in order to counter the force of law of nature, you cannot just pick and choose one law of nature as opposed to the other. So most of our actions can be explained in terms of conflicting laws of nature. Like, for example, I'm hungry and physiologically I want to eat, but I'm also afraid of killing people and getting food when I get hungry because I'm afraid of being punished. And that's also a physiological law or something like that. So the issue here is that to understand specifically what autonomy is, because he doesn't just give any law unto itself. Whenever I say, oh, I give the law of eating when I'm hungry to myself, you can't do that. That's not autonomy. Autonomy is only the concept of freedom, morality, sorry. So that's the connection when I say, what's the relationship between freedom and the moral law? It turns out that for Kant, you can only be free if you follow the moral law. In any other case, you are not free. You consider yourself subject to laws of nature, and if you prefer one law of nature over another or something like that, then you consider yourself free. But that's wrong for Kant. That's not the true understanding of freedom. True understanding is only when you follow no natural laws, no laws of nature, but only the law that you give to yourself. And that law can only be given in one form, categorical imperative, even though I ask you in your question, number 5, categorical imperative, explain its various formulations. That categorical imperative is the moral law that tells us how to act, but it never concerns a content, a circumstance, a consequence. It always concerns the form of the maxim according to which we should act to be moral and free. Now, if you don't understand, if you are confused, if you have questions, please ask, because some of you then ask me questions later on, and those are good questions, and I wish everybody would hear those questions. So if you have a question, the chances that other people have that question too, so don't feel like you are taking up time or, you know, being selfish or something like that.
What do you mean by like form of like maxims? What you said?
Okay, the answer to that question, you said maxim?
I mean the form of maxim.
Yes. A maxim,
yeah.
A maxim, it is explained on page 13, footnote 13. A maxim is the subjective principle of evolution. So the reason, what is the principle according to which I am acting? Now, on page, I can find that, on page 41, I read that paragraph at the bottom that explains the concept of maxim. The aforementioned 3 ways of representing the principle of morality, which you are going to discuss, and the various formulations of the categorical imperative, are at bottom only so many formulas of the same law, right? One of them by itself contains a combination of the other 2. Nevertheless, there's a difference in them which is subjectively rather than objectively practical. It is intended to bring an idea of reason closer to intuition in accordance with a certain analogy, and thereby closer to feelings. So he is expressing these in different ways in order to bring it closer to our intuition. Now, all maxims, he says, have a form. That's what I meant in terms of form of the maxim, which consists in universality. And in this respect, the formula of the moral imperative is expressed thus: maxims must be so chosen as if they were to hold as universal laws of nature. Now, it is confusing here because the term here, as if they are going to be laws of nature, but they are not. So this as if is also something that he expressed on page 36, another formulation of categorical imperative. I'm sorry, it's not on page 36. Okay, on 30, I'm sorry, page 30. The third full paragraph, namely 4th paragraph on the page, on page 30. According to the universal imperative of duty makes be expressed thus: act as if the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. Now, it is misleading here. It is not a law of nature. If it were a law of nature, it would not be moral. Act as if it has the same necessity of, same universality of a law of nature. And that only concerns the form of your maxim, because you cannot make the content of any maxim universal. You can only make the form of it universal. So going back to page 41, or going forward to page 1, a matter, that means an end. And here the formula says that a rational being, and as much as he is by his very nature an end, and hence an end in himself, must serve in every maxim as a condition limiting all merely relative and arbitrary ends. So if your maxim has a content, that content should always treat humanity in the person of yourself and in the other as an end, never as a means. So, in terms of content, imperatives have objects, like you need to achieve a goal. What is the goal of your action? Why are you doing this? In morality, you cannot really give any other end, other object, any other justification than treating yourself and the other human beings as an end in itself and never as a means. And 3, a complete determination of all maxims by the formula that all maxims proceeding from this own legislation ought to harmonize with a possible kingdom of ends as a kingdom of nature. So as if human beings have a rational order that is akin to natural order. Now, this might be a little confusing in terms of what he is trying to achieve. Just think of it in terms of the principle of universalizability. Your maxim should have the form to be consistently, without contradiction, universalizable. No maxim would be universalizable if it only serves your selfish practical purpose, because it depends on the condition. Now, the example that we gave in terms of lying is such a condition. When you lie, you have an end inside, like you want to do it for a reason. That reason can never be universalized because it is always specific to your condition. Now, if you try to go ahead and say, I would like to universalize this maxim, let's say, then you are universalizing lying. And the paradox that I explained before is when you lie and universalize the principle of lying, you cannot lie anymore. It undermines itself, because in order to achieve your end, you need your lie to function as if it is true, so that the person believes it and you achieve the end by lying. That is the almost logical but rational idea. Yes, you might lie, but you cannot make lying a moral principle. You can justify it in terms of whatever specific purpose, whatever lofty specific purpose that you have. So when I say I lie in order to save my loved ones, I lie in order to save the lives of innocent people, fine. But you still want the person that you lie to believe in what you say. And for that person to believe in what you say, not the lying, but the principle of telling the truth should be the universal one. So even in your specific action, whatever purpose is, you are lying, you are still endorsing universality of telling the truth. Now, of course, to me, obviously, Kant works much better negatively in terms of identifying what actions people claim to be moral are not moral, actually. And you know that. So these are like selfish reasons. And that gives us a perspective that I think is very useful to be able to distinguish certain motivations with which people act in society. Now, one of the famous speeches, which is kind of old for you, that I remember, I think, yeah, Bill Clinton one of our former presidents, gave this talk in which he was talking like, we are going to do this and we are going to bomb something. I don't know what it was. And he said like, this is to our national interests, that is good for our economic interests, and it is the right thing to do. Now, that right thing to do at the end is somehow giving an ostensible moral justification of what you are clearly doing for selfish reasons, which you already said that it is according to our best interest. So what you are doing here is, of course, nobody takes that seriously, I guess. I mean, some people maybe do. But if you are acting for selfish reasons and you are observing other people acting for selfish reasons, when they say, in addition, I'm also moral, then you realize this is not really what morality is. And everybody knows this at some rational level, Kant believes. So negatively, therefore, it is very, to me, useful to distinguish the logic of morality from the logic of all purposes. Now, positively, and also that's his strength, he doesn't really give you a template. Well, he does give you a template, but he doesn't tell you specifically what to do, what not to do. He doesn't even tell you things like don't kill, don't lie, etc., because he knows we kill, we lie, they cannot be as content. So I can give you the tools or logical or rational structure according to how you should think about your actions. But ultimately, you are the only one who knows what you are, why you are doing what you are doing. If that at all. I mean, I claim that sometimes we don't, not sometimes, most of the time, we don't even know what we do, why we do what we do. But at least for Kant, you cannot judge the morality of the action by its appearance, by seeing it. It is the reason, the motivation, the maxim, the principle behind the action that determines the morality of it. And it also fits with our intuition that whenever we observe certain actions, we never really know why they are done. And if we suspect their reasons, then we don't consider them moral. So he explains that, we touched upon that on page 19 at the very beginning of the second edition, when he says, in fact, there is absolutely no possibility by means of experience to make out with complete certainty a single case in which the maxim of an action that may in other respects conform to duty has rested solely on moral grounds and on the representation of one's duty. So it's impossible to determine that, according to Kant. Okay, any questions so far, please? Unclear points? Yes, I can sometimes see your hand, but yeah.
We talked about autonomy, but I'm a little bit confused about heteronomy.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit about that, maybe?
Sure. This is on page, starting on page 44, where he starts explaining autonomy, and then 45 is the heteronomy of the will. So heteronomy of the will as the source of all spurious principles of morality. If the will seeks the law, that is to determine it anywhere, but in the fitness of its maxim for its own legislation of universal laws, and if thus goes outside of itself and seeks this law in the character of any of its objects, then heteronomy always results. So this is first the explanation of morality other than itself. Namely, why should you be moral? Now you give a law for the justification of moral laws, which for Kant, it's the definition of non-autonomy, heteronomy. But how do we do that? When you are growing up, maybe, I don't know, parents still do that. That was a pedagogical thing. So do they tell you, like, did they ever tell you at any given point that you should act moral? Do you remember this as a kind of particular experience when your parents sat you down and said, you should be moral? Really? Did it happen?
Kind of.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, my dad would have like talks with me throughout the years, and he was like, we were like discussing morality. And he was kind of like, you know, like, you need to define what your sense of morality is, so you know what you believe and what you don't.
Yeah, it's usually not. I shouldn't say that, but dads do that kind of annoying thing to like tell you how to act or something like that. I do that to my daughters too. So, but when you sort of, at some point, you want to, in anybody, instill this idea of morality, you are doing it just for the sake of that it is right, but not for anything else. Because if, for example, let's just say we live in a predominantly or in majority Christian countries still at this point, somebody says, you have to act moral because we are Christians, because we believe in certain principles. Those principles are told us by the things that we believe, etc. Now, it might achieve an end, but for Kant, you are not really being autonomous. You are being heteronomous because you are acting according to a principle that ultimately is outside of your reason. And it lies in your Christianity or whatever religion that you choose. So that is a law of the other. Hetero, like heterosexuality, the same word, hetero, which is the other sexuality or other law. Other law other than the law of the maxim becoming a law unto itself, other than rational being a law unto itself. So it is the other side, the opposite of autonomy, not auto, but hetero. So what are these laws? These are always laws that try to justify morality in terms of something else. But for them, they are always hypothetical. Namely, if you are a Christian, you can be moral, right? So if you want to go to heaven, I don't know what Christianity or why Christianity commands the kinds of things that it commands, but if it, I mean, you can follow it. It's like any code of conduct. But if you want to be moral, then you have to justify it in terms of what? Why? Why should I be? Why should I be moral? Then you give an explanation. You say, I don't know. I'm not Christian. I don't know whether Christians know that either, but like, I want to go to heaven, maybe. I mean, that's the most simplistic and straightforward. I want not to be punished when I die. And it's like, yeah, but that's kind of selfish. That's kind of still self-interest. That's like, what if you don't care about being punished? What if you are not going to be punished? What if then, if you don't care about that, you don't have a responsibility to be moral? Any explanation that you bring to morality immediately raises this question as to whether, because of that condition, am I not capable of morality if I'm not Christian? And the other side of it, if I'm not capable, am I not responsible for being moral? So when you say, I mean, I give Christianity, let's give another, not pick on any religion, like, I'm Muslim, so I act morally because I'm a devout Muslim. Now, am I saying that other people who are not Muslims, because that's a condition, that's an empirical condition, cannot be moral? And more importantly, am I also saying like, oh, since they are not lucky enough to be born as Muslims, they don't have the obligation to be moral? Can I only expect morality from Muslim people? Can I not expect morality that they will not do what I would not do to them, to me, if they are from other religion? So we really undermine this universal aspect of morality by making some people more dignified, more respected than others. We say, you can only be. Now, if you say there are multiple ways of being moral, I'm sure that you as good citizens will probably say, well, Christians are moral in this way, Muslims are moral, they're all moral in their own way. Would you say that just to avoid this uncomfortable discussion? Or not? Or do you insist that your morality is the only one? I mean, what would you say politically? I mean, if you were asked. Anybody? Maybe you don't want to step into this. Don't be afraid. Yeah, Rossi, go ahead.
Can you repeat the question real quick before I try to answer?
The question is, if somebody says, I'm moral, my morality, my moral conduct, the way I behave comes from Christianity, right? And the other person says, like I might say, look, I was born in a Muslim space, Muslim country, so my morality comes from Islam. Somebody says mine comes from Judaism or Hinduism or whatever. So like, how do we negotiate that? What do we say? Do we say, well, they are moral in their own way and I'm moral in my own way? They are all acceptable, whatever people choose.
I don't know, I guess my answer for that would be like, neither of those options are correct, because I feel like maybe some aspects could be more like universally like what we've been talking about. And like, I remember like you saying like, I think in the beginning of this, like a bunch of his like Kant's like critics, like kind of almost like attacked him in a way because there's no one sense of like what is moral due to like difference in society. So I feel like it's kind of almost impossible to determine like one is more moral than the other, just for the fact that there could be certain things that are universally moral versus black.
I think you're right. I mean, that's a good, I think a reasonable interpretation. Empirically, it is really not possible for us to negotiate that. So when there's a specific sort of, not in a Kantian sense, but in a religious sense, moral principle in one religion, it is really very difficult to negotiate that with the principle of another religion. Because they are empirical principles, they are telling you do this, don't do that, etc. But underlying all this, there's always the possibility of whether we can universalize these particular laws. Now, with respect to content, it cannot be universalized because it emerges in a context, emerges in a geographical space, under certain conditions, in time, etc. But we can negotiate even within our religion. So the question is, do we follow all the rules of our religion? No, nobody quite does it. How is it that we decide this is a rule that I want to follow, but this is not a rule I want to follow? How is that even possible? If my entire moral thinking, my ability to reason in terms of morality were to come from a religion, logically speaking, I wouldn't even be able to negotiate which principles to follow, which principles not to follow. So this is where Kantian thinking is most powerful because there is a reason. And by reason, I don't mean cause, I mean rationality, my ability to think and act rationally, etc. That's reason with a, if you want, capital R, but not just a cause. There's a reason for everything type of thing. But reason allows me to negotiate certain principles that I choose to follow and certain principles that I choose not to follow. Now, this might be my upbringing, this might be my family, etc., but it is possible. That is the reason in every human being to be able to think about morality. He believes that it is universal, just like Descartes believed that good sense is distributed evenly. Kant believes that this is a universal condition for all rational beings. Now, therefore, when you are talking about morality, by logic, according to Kant, you cannot make morality the property and under the tutelage of any specific content within the world. So you cannot say, you should not say, logically speaking, that morality comes from Christianity. My moral reasoning might allow me to follow the rules of Christianity or not, but morality cannot be justified in terms of any religion, any heteronomous principle. Now, let's stop picking on any particular religion, but let's just say, for example, people who try to explain morality by natural causes. Like imagine a fictional biologist who say, morality is a code of conduct to people just invented in order to survive as a group without undermining themselves. That sounds like a reasonable explanation. At first, they say, oh, morality is nothing. Philosophers are stupid. Morality is nothing. It's just a very natural occurrence among human beings in order to survive as a species. Right? That almost gives you a cool explanation. You don't have to worry about any of these things. It's just like they just don't know all the laws of nature from which human beings come up with these stupid laws and stupid ideas to act in a certain way. They all change historically. They all are different at different times depending on what serves our purpose. So there's really no morality that can be explained in terms of autonomy. It's just law of nature, that law of nature being a complicated version of evolution. Right? Does that make sense? I mean, some of you might even think that. Like, we are talking about this. I know there's no morality. I know nobody's acting that way. This is just like wishful thinking and naive way philosophers engage with ideas. Their head is up in the clouds, etc. They're just talking about nonsense. There's a perfectly scientific, empirical explanation for why we act morally, and therefore it's actually meaningless. So that's also heteronomy, because you are trying to explain morality in terms of some other law other than rational being giving a law unto itself. So how would Kant, actually I should make this into a paper topic. Our paper topic is way less speculative. This is more speculative. Anyway, so how would Kant respond to that? That might save you from reading the rest of the text if you believe it, and you can say, oh, morality is nothing but people trying to survive together without killing each other. So that's still answering your question earlier about heteronomy.
Like how Kant would respond to the claim that like morality emerged from like natural reasoning or like natural evolution.
Yes. Like somebody, some of you even might sort of think, oh, we have been talking about morality for the last 2 weeks now, but it's really not something so rational or mysterious or whatever for Kant. It is just something that people make up in order to survive as a group and impose upon each other certain rules so that the society functions properly and brings happiness, which obviously didn't, but still. So that kind of naturalistic explanation of morality, that it is based on human survival. Because, you know, biologists know really well how human beings should survive or did survive. So the question is, what would be Kant's response to this? I mean, he would regard that as heteronomous. That's a law of some other law trying to justify morality.
So like, wouldn't you like almost in a way just kind of be upset with it? Because if that were the case, wouldn't we all be moral at that point? If it came from like a natural like evolution, like in a way it would kind of contradict itself. Because if we all knew what was moral and how to act morally, we wouldn't have the question, what is morality?
That's actually a great answer. Yes, very, very true. Like, if it is, I mean, you should also ask biologists to bring this explanation, is that, oh, morality is nothing but so that, then why don't we do it? But there's always exceptions, right? I mean, like, is there a way to explain the logic of self-killing in terms of evolution? Because if the governing principle is survival, then why are these things happening? So I don't know how biologists might explain that. They might explain it for some physiological causes, psychological causes, etc. But you're right, then the question is still there. Like, if this is a law of nature, how come that's not happening all the time? Why is there even a problem of morality? Why doesn't everybody know what morality is and act accordingly? That's actually a very insightful, precise answer. Like, why don't we act morally then? That's actually a really good question. Why don't we act morally if it is just to our best interest? And for the most part, we do, I guess. I mean, of course, that depends. But like, so that was my question to what Kant would, how we would respond to something like that. But I like Rosie's answer. Why don't we always act morally if it is such a natural thing? So underlying this whole discussion is my sort of attempt to sort of voicing Kant to demonstrate the necessity of us having a universal moral reasoning, even when we deny the universal aspect of morality. Because we deny that empirically almost consistently. Even when we say there are no laws, empirical laws, that can apply universally. But in our concept of duty and the moral law, we also have an inescapable dimension that it must be universal. Because we are rational beings, in our reasoning, there is the principle of equality. At some point, we want to believe that all human beings are just like us, no more or no less, and we should respect them as rational beings. Now, we might not empirically agree to this all the time, but that's our structure of our reasoning according to Kant. Now, a principle like golden rule that somebody brought up can only be justified on the basis of that. Because it sounds like an empirical principle, but it is a sort of more universal. And Kant says all the sort of principles that we explain universally, like love your neighbor. Like he says, you cannot love your neighbor. You cannot demand somebody love somebody else in any condition. But that love is there, not a pathological love. It is a respect for rational love, that you should treat them as human beings, as rational beings. So, going back to the question of heteronomy, if I bring any law of religion, law of nature, law of culture, etc., to explain morality, then I am making it hypothetical. I am making it subordinate to some other principle that cannot be actually universalized. So all the heteronomous laws, like all the principles that are heteronomous, are actually, as he say, they try to subordinate it to an object. Object is whatever that law intends to achieve. So in Christianity, going to heaven, I suppose. Is there any other like motivation that would people rationally accept? Like, you need to have a reward. You have to say, you got to heaven.
Maybe like approval from God, or like,
yes,
because you can have approval, like God can approve of things that you do even if you don't end up going to heaven in the end, right? That's
why not? I mean, if God approves everything I do, I better go to heaven. That's the contract.
well, can it be like certain things are good that you do, but certain things are not? I don't know.
I want to do things that will definitely get me to heaven. That, I mean, right? That's my. So if somebody says, I don't want to go to heaven, it'll be a really boring place, and I won't have fun or something like that. Of course, I'm being flippant. That's not what it is. But if you don't accept those principles, then you are not supposed to be moral. Then you cannot be moral. So are you saying that you can be moral in many different ways, and Christianity is one of them? Right? I mean, a good Christian today in the 21st century should say that. You can be moral in many different ways. Christianity is one of them. I want to know what is common to all ways in which one can be moral. What is common in Christianity, in Islam, is blah, blah. In every way you admit that one can be moral. This is a sort of Socratic question, right? So what is common to all of them? And that's human reason. Therefore, that's more valuable. Okay, now, I want you to take your time to explain the relationship between freedom and moral law as detailed as possible. So when I think about grading these papers, I'm assuming you are going to give correct definitions of duty, maxim, will. And when you answer will, you should really also, among other things, concentrate on unconditional good, and also will on page 13, when he talks about that it's at the crossroads, that it can be determined by a priori principles and a posteriori incentives. That's the section that you need to concentrate on. Also hypothetical and categorical imperative, hopefully we covered that. And then the heteronomy versus autonomy, self-law giving as opposed to taking your law from something else. Now, I assume you are going to answer these, but the variations in your grades will be how well you articulate these both in your own words, but also give me the sense that you are understood it such that you are comfortable in using these concepts in various contexts precisely. So you can say freedom, like you can say freedom is not as most people understand freedom today, but for Kant, freedom has a specific meaning, and that's autonomy, and there's only one way of being free, etc. So the more you explain it, the more you make it your own and feel comfortable in your explanations, your grade will vary according to that. But I'm hoping that most of you will get at least the basic definitions and concepts down such that your grade will start at some level. Good level, I mean, high level. Yes, Isa.
I just have a question about like going back to your discussion about like natural evolution.
Okay.
Like you finished explaining about it. I just didn't understand like how you like overcome this argument.
Well, I went with Rosie's answer. If there was a natural law that would explain morality,
Mm-hmm.
then a simple question would be, why don't people act accordingly? Why is morality even a problem?
Yeah.
Now, if you explain human capacity to be moral in terms of evolution,
Mm-hmm.
then you are saying that certain human beings in the past didn't have the capacity to be moral because it changes according to evolution. But also, once we evolve more than what we are now, I suppose, we are going to be more moral or something.
Mm-hmm.
For Kant, these are all empirical circumstances that change.
Yeah.
But there is a not historical, not contextual reason in human beings. And when I make a judgment about something in the past,
Mm-hmm.
I don't relativize that. And we believe that, like, does anybody here think, I want to know, like, oh, slavery was moral then, not moral now? No, slavery was not moral then, is not moral now, will not be moral in the future. I mean, because it, among other things, contradicts the most basic human rational principle that you should never treat as human being as means, let alone property. I mean, property is definitely a means. So not even as means, but not property. So this is a universal principle.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't change with evolution. Now, our customs, our laws, our political laws, our whatever might change,
Mm-hmm.
but the morality of it remains the same.
Okay.
So when you make claims like that, Kant says that you cannot make morality, the moral reasoning, relative. Now, if you use morals loosely as cultural laws, sure, they change. Sure, they evolve, hopefully evolve, sometimes devolve, depending on whether it's 2020 or not. So it changes. But the basic reasoning of morality, you cannot consistently say slavery was moral then, but is immoral now. No, you can say people thought it was acceptable back then. And there were a lot of people also at the same time thought that it was immoral. So it's not like all those people were like, oh, slavery is a wonderful thing or something like that. A lot of people thought that it was not acceptable. And it wasn't acceptable. And it's not acceptable now. And there will not be any time in the future that it is going to be acceptable.
Yeah.
That doesn't change according to anything, evolution, etc. This is Kant's reasoning. Now, it is a little sounding dogmatic, I suppose, for some of you, because you don't want to judge the previous generations, I suppose, but you should judge the previous generations because that's what it is.
Mhm.
I mean, I cannot consistently say, oh, slavery was okay then, now I find it morally objectionable. I find it morally objectionable at any given point.
Okay. So then the changing morality, like evolving morality is like cannot happen because it's always the same and it's based on empirical state, right?
It's not based on empirical state.
Oh, okay.
So their empirical conditions change. So you cannot rationally say that it was moral for them.
Mm-hmm.
Like for them, whatever, whenever people. So it has never been moral. People might have thought that wrongly at that time. That I grant, that you can grant. But you cannot change absolutely whether it was moral or not. You cannot say it was moral back then.
Okay.
That's not how we think.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not how we should think either. So, it was moral back then. There is a built-in universality in our moral judgments, according to Kant.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you might not accept that. You might find philosophical arguments that, that's not true or something like that. But for Kant, it is the case. We have a priori principles in our reason that tells us something about morality. That's why a lot of people find Kant both very demanding, but also, since he doesn't give us any content, very cold and not very useful. Because again, Kant will not say slavery is wrong. I mean, he will not say it's right, obviously, but he will say, you need to find a principle according to which any maxim of slavery doesn't contradict itself. And it does. I mean, you need to be able to think, reason, without somebody telling you slavery is wrong, that slavery is wrong. I mean, that's why I don't sort of understand, like, people need to be told what is wrong. People need to be able to think, to figure out for themselves what is wrong. So we teach morality like as if it's a sort of an empirical class, or so, like how to be moral. Tell me what is moral, what is not. No, you need to be able to think, figure out, reason yourself whether something is moral or not. Do you really need to be told by someone, by the way, in case you didn't understand slavery was wrong? There is no principle according to which slavery can ever be justified, period. And you cannot even like justify, oh, this is the moral march of our country into the future or something like that. No, it was immoral then, it was immoral now, and it's always going to be immoral. And that's how human beings think. if they think. So Kant really makes morality not a question of proper disposition, proper personality, proper love of human beings, etc. It's really an ability to think. Reason. Not your character, not what kind of a person you are, not whether you are a happy person or an unhappy person or pathological person or not pathological person. It doesn't matter. Everybody has the capacity to be moral because everybody has the capacity to be rational. So, some heteronomous principles, Nolia. For example, I ought not to lie if I would maintain my reputation. Now, you made reputation more important than morality. I ought not to lie, even though lying were to bring me not the slightest discredit. So that's how autonomous principle would work. It doesn't matter whether people love me or not. It doesn't matter whether I'm popular or not. It doesn't matter whether I have a good or bad reputation. None of it matters. I should not lie, period. I should not lie whether this is to my advantage. I should not lie when it is against my advantage, for my disadvantage. Never. So sometimes people also say, like, I act morally because I want to make people happy. And that's also a kind of nice sounding, but ultimately destructive principle, because you are making the morality of yourself or others conditional to other people's happiness. You shouldn't be happy from being moral. There's nothing, because if you are happy, you are probably afraid of not sounding or seeming moral. You are happy that you have a good reputation, people love you. I don't know why people are happy. I mean, I never understand. But that's not morality. I mean, it's not autonomy. Now, of course, according to Kant, you will never have the pleasure of being approved by other people of how moral you are. That also applies to Kant, by the way. I mean, Kant himself, as an empirical human being, I wouldn't judge him moral. So he cannot even manage to apply these principles of his own thinking to himself as a human being. So don't think of Kant as some kind of moral paragon of morality or something like that. As a human being, he is, I mean, let's just say not moral, if not horrible. So the idea here is that every rational being, including ourselves, obviously, have the capacity to think this. It's not like we are taking Kant in any sense as our role model or something like that. And that's really like a good thing in philosophy. You can hate all the philosophers, but still love philosophy. So he says explicitly on page 46, all principles that can be taken from this point of view are either empirical or rational. The first kind drawn from principle of happiness. All the principles, empirical principles, are derived from happiness, are based upon either physical or moral feeling. The second kind, from the principle of perfection, are based upon either the rational concept as possible effect of our will, or else upon the concept of independent perception of God. Empirical principles are wholly unsuited to serve as the foundation for moral laws. So if you come up with any empirical principle, empirical meaning something derived from your experience, etc., then those are not. Now, you can imitate other people. You can learn empirical principles from other people, but that imitation itself guarantees that you are not being moral. You are just following somebody's empirical principle. So nobody can actually either teach you or show you or give you by experience how you should be moral. It is in your reason, in everybody has the capacity to act moral. So ultimately, you need to respect and trust the person to do the right thing. And well, I guess the only thing you can teach them is how to think. That's it. You cannot give them like advice or recommendation or do this and do that. And like ultimately, like people give you advice, I suppose, your parents and stuff like that. But at some point, they need to trust your judgment. You need to be able to figure out, because I'm not going to be there in every empirical situation to tell you what to do. You need to be able to think for yourself. And by that, I don't mean for your empirical self. People mostly confuse this in philosophy as well as in other sort of self-help kind of context. People say, you need to think for yourself. What does that even mean? Well, obviously, everybody thinks for themselves, but not self as individual empirical self, because you already do that. So you are not thinking like, oh, I have my own truths and in my experience, blah, blah. No, thinking for yourself is really a universal condition, just like we saw with Descartes. It is an ability to understand the universal nature of human thinking. And it cannot be taught. You need to do it for yourself, because every teaching will be empirical, but your own thinking will be purely formal and for yourself. So it really goes with Kant's notion of morality, that it cannot be taught, it cannot be brought about through examples. I mean, people make analogies and give you wonderful sounding advice, etc. But they all useful to the extent that they trigger this notion of your ability to think for yourself universally rather than selfishly. Because everybody can think for themselves selfishly. I mean, even babies do that. Like I want this and that. I mean, it's like there is no reason behind it. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about the second section, but we are going to move to the third one, because that's really, the third one is the most important in answering the first question of the paper topic: what is Kant's definition of freedom? So on page 49, and I want you to read 49 to the end. You don't need to read the supposed principle, right to lie. Page 262. So your assignment for Tuesday is 49 to 62. It's only 13, 14 pages. But this starts out with, the will is a kind of causality belonging to living beings insofar as they are rational. So he is repeating this idea that will can be the cause of cause in the world, just like laws of nature are causes. Freedom would be the property of this causality that makes it effective, independent of any determination by alien causes. Alien causes here means, again, heteronomy, other causes, alien causes. This is will just being a cause onto itself. That's freedom. So in a sense, maybe you can say, well, I can't explain Kant's definition of freedom because it cannot be explained. I mean, don't say that, but it really means autonomy. Therefore, it can only be understood in terms of its own principle. And it's empty in the sense that just act for the sake of the law. What is that law? Lawfulness, nothing else. No specific law. Never tells you any specific law. Okay, any questions? Are we getting tired?